take a turn here to something. And we'll tie in a topic that's been going on and we've been discussing here with social media as well, this conversation. But there was a terrible tragedy in Syria that took place yesterday, a series of terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka, South Asian nation, island country, that has killed about 300 people, including several Americans, hundreds as well injured. Attacks taking place with bombings at churches, Catholic churches, on Easter Sunday, and at hotels and other places that clearly had religious orientation. It does seem like reports suggest perhaps some radical Islamists engaging in this activity. It is interesting to note that Sri Lanka is a predominantly Buddhist country. About 10% or so, if I recall correctly, are Muslims, and about 7.4% are Catholics in the country. And this is just an absolutely devastating attack that this would take place on Easter Sunday. Pope Francis has come out talking about this, calling it cruel, an act of cruel violence. Says, I want to express my loving closeness to the Christian community targeted while they were gathered in prayer and all the victims of such cruel violence. I entrust to the Lord all those who were tragically killed and pray for the injured and all those who are suffering as a result of this dramatic event. Now, I have for years now been talking with good friend of the program, friend of mine, Roshini Rajkumar, here on the radio airwaves, and of course has become a contributor here on Business for Breakfast. She's a personal brand strategist, presence engineer, multimedia content creator. She began her career as a TV broadcaster, really impressive background, licensed attorney, author of the book Communicate That, her website ownyourwow.com. She has her own podcast, Real Leaders with Roshini. But one thing we haven't really talked about is her background as an immigrant coming to this country at the age of 22 months from Sri Lanka. And I wanted to bring on Roshini to talk about this travesty and tragedy, just heartbreaking events of yesterday, terrorist attacks taking place. She's also, like me, a Catholic, and of course Catholics were the victims of yesterday's atrocities. Roshini Rajkumar, good morning, my friend, and welcome.
Good morning, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on this morning. Kind of somber topic for us, but important to talk about.
Well, a happy Easter to you as well.
You too. Happy Easter Monday.
So let me just ask you, and then we'll get to your background and some of these things, your overarching thoughts on yesterday.
Well, just, a lot of sadness. I mean, it was just not something I would imagine waking up to on Sunday. And, you see these headlines and, when I was a TV news reporter, I reported on them. As a talk show host, I talk about them regularly and interview different kinds of people connected with those events. But when it really touches home like this, and I say that almost kind of in a bizarre way, because I came to the U.S. when I was 22 months. I'm a United States citizen. I'm a proud American, a proud patriot, but I do feel very strongly about my ethnic background and a proud Sri Lankan American. And I have not been back. And in fact, just on Friday, I was sharing with a business colleague that I hope to go back to Sri Lanka to celebrate my 50th birthday, which is coming up in a few years. But we were talking about it, and he had traveled there, and he's not Sri Lankan at all. And we were just having this great conversation on Friday about Sri Lanka. So
wow.
to have this happen Sunday morning, I was just stunned. I actually emailed him this morning, and I know he's thinking about people he knows there and colleagues there. So it just really touches home, even though I have not been back. No really close family members are there. My mom has some distant friends and childhood friends and cousins there, but nobody really close with us. But it still seems like it's so personal to me.
Well, then you throw in the fact that it was a religious act, an act of anti-Catholic terrorism yesterday, and you yourself being Catholic. I mean, I even feel an additional stinging component myself to just the general sense of horror at the tragic human loss because of being Catholic as well, that there is that sort of connection. But you're a Sri Lankan Catholic, a Sri Lankan American Catholic.
Yeah, and, Catholics in Sri Lanka, you said they're up to about 7.8%. When my parents were there and when I was born, it was even smaller percentage who were Christian and even smaller percentage who were Catholic. So it was, my mom always says, when we've talked about this topic in the past, that religion was never really an issue in Sri Lanka. The past ethnic struggles and war has been between the races, the majority Sinhalese and the minority Tamils. But she said she grew up getting the holidays off from school of all the different religions, the Christians, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and the Muslims. They lived in religious harmony, even if they didn't always live in racial harmony. So that's what really hit home for her. Actually, a local TV station interviewed her yesterday. She was on our 10 o'clock news here on one of the stations talking about such a stark change is that it's a religious connection, a religious hatred and terrorism, which allegedly is an Islamic group against the Catholics there. So that's a whole different storyline or narrative for the country. And I don't know where it's going to go because it is not really part of the culture that I knew or that has been described to be my parents.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating just looking at it in terms of historical comparison, that if it used to be a civil war associated with a racial and ethnic divide, and now you're looking at something that is much more rooted in religion. But not only that we're talking about an attack from the, potentially, I mean, it appears to be this way, and they're still looking into it, but allegedly the idea that it was a Islamist attack, that you've got one of the religious minorities in the country, again, it's primarily Buddhist, attacking another religious minority in the country.
Yeah, I mean, it really is, now we're in the shock phase, but as you recited some of the numbers, and I just noticed on the Guardian's website that the first American citizen has been identified as one of the foreign nationals who were killed in that. So these kinds of events, Jimmy, also show us that tragedies are never about one country because we have free borders for the most part and people travel all over the world. So when one group of terrorists decides to attack a specific group, that is not the only group that is hurt. We are all hurt, for different reasons, but on so many levels we are all hurt because of the nature of travel and the nature of how multicultural our world is now.
Yeah, there's a note here by the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal. They say world leaders are denouncing the attack on, quote, humanity. But make no mistake, this was an attack on Christians, and it quite clearly was the case. And one thing that we're noticing, Roshini Rajkumar, on the world stage right now has been an increase, whether it's in the Middle East or it's in Asia, other parts of the world, in persecution of Christians. And we're talking not just about, the notion of a baker not being able to make decide whether or not they want to make a cake, but we're talking about life or death situations, bombings like we saw in Sri Lanka, or torture and slavery and those kinds of things in the Middle East. And this kind of thing is on the rise.
Yes, and the other thing, as far as branding, which is what you and I talk about, these terrorists selected the most holy day in the Catholic calendar. They were strategic. They were intentional about this. Talk about intentional. And they chose that day. And even as you and I probably, I know I felt this as I was in church yesterday at Mass, it was crossing my mind, like these people were just in Sri Lanka in their churches, just like I am right now. And this happened so out of the blue. So it can happen, and terrorists, no matter what stripe the terrorists are, they are intentional about how they go in and are destructive. And this was, as far as branding goes, it's the most destructive day for Catholics they could have chosen.
Oh, absolutely. And one thing that I do want to note is in the Journal op-ed or editorial, they note that at least the church that some of their editorial board members go to in New York City, there was an increased police presence. And I even noticed, and it didn't actually hit me until I read this piece as to why they were there, but that there was, and I don't normally see even on Easter a police car, but there was a Arapahoe County Sheriff's deputy parked out front of the church that I was going to yesterday.
Yeah, and that's what we're talking about here. It is not an isolated incident. Terrorists know they are trying to really direct a message at more of the world than just that set of victims that they decide to bomb. And, then now we're in the reaction stage, the early reaction stage, still getting information about the dead and the wounded and names and things like that. So there is some panic still going on. But this is an important time for the Sri Lankan government to come together and also get over and not revisit some of the racial tension that's happened in the past and really focus on what just happened on Easter Sunday and try to build some new bridges in the country of Sri Lanka. And I do still hope to go back. It's been far too long, but I also hope that travel doesn't start to get minimized to Sri Lanka once it gets past this.
One thing that, since you mentioned the Sri Lankan government, this has been very striking. Again, we're talking with Roshini Rajkumar here on Business for Breakfast, and that is that, and this dovetails in with questions of fake news and social media regulation and so forth that we've discussed, you and I, on this program, and I've had many a discussion with others on the show as well. And that is the notion that the Sri Lankan government is blocking access to social media, for example, WhatsApp and Facebook, in that country because they're worried about the spread of disinformation. And yet, if you think about it, this is also a way for people to be able to connect up with their family members, make sure that they're okay. I mean, that's the primary purpose of social media, right, is to actually be able to communicate with people that you haven't seen for a long time or maybe that are clear across the country. It's an easier way to do that. It can be cheaper than sometimes, a full cell phone plan if you're able to at least get a computer at a cafe or something like that and then access the internet. But there's this crackdown here because of the concern about the spread of disinformation. Yet at the same time, you can also get a more accurate spread of information from time to time via social media and get messages out to people who might otherwise be disconnected from it.
No, exactly. There's so many different layers about the social media piece. What I'd like to think is the majority of those layers are positive, finding people through them, identifying, making sure they're safe, those kinds of things, letting other family know some of this has happened, all of those things. But it is bad, it is sad that there are evil forces out there that will use it to spread misinformation, in some cases fake news. But the key is that you look at the sources who are sending information. So, as I looked at the Guardian report this morning online, it had different news agencies talking about their own nationals, and they really did pull from a variety of different official agencies. They weren't just the Guardian reporters, found this out third hand. So those are the kinds of things that the rest of us have to be discerning when we are reading the news or taking in the images or the different sound bites and put it into the context of where we are now in the tragedy, which is not the day of, although I also woke up to more to news on Twitter about another bomb near the airport. I need to double check if, the accuracy of all that. But the bottom line is hopefully we're past the worst of the day. And now it's getting the facts straight, finding out who the people are so that their families can be involved and not adding to the drama on social media. So I hope people can have a little restraint on social media.
Certainly, although that's an easy thing to say you hope for and not necessarily to get. That's for darn sure. Yeah. But Roshini Rajkumar, when we look at the question about really this debate over social media right now and how to regulate speech and the flow of information and that kind of thing, now you even have Mark Zuckerberg just pleading for the government to take that responsibility off of his hands. I think there are a few different reasons for that. But nevertheless, these companies are now embracing regulation. They're saying, we want you to be more involved in this kind of stuff. I'm deeply concerned about the notion of government regulating speech online or otherwise. And I think that sometimes the fake news aspect of social media is just a risk you have to run with in order to be a free society with a free flow of information and of ideas. Because then there's also the question of how do you ferret what sources are appropriate or not? Are you going to be correct in saying that this source is illegitimate when they could just be something that your institution disagrees with, or maybe that the prevailing authorities in government don't like, and what have you? So what do you make about this debate? Because it dovetails in not just with Sri Lankan government shutting things down there for right now, but here in the United States where we have these questions swirling about.
Well, I am definitely a lover of the Constitution as an ex-reporter. TV reporter, I always, the First Amendment is what I continue to try to live by. A beautiful part of our country, the United States, is that we do have that freedom of speech. We can't necessarily dictate what other countries do. But if we're talking about these social media outlets, part of the reason they're saying this now, Jimmy, is because what we watched Facebook go through in 2018 and is still under, major attack for some of its practices. They're looking for a scapegoat. So they're saying, oh, maybe we do need the regulation. So it's an interesting mixed bag that the Facebooks of the world are trying to sort of feed us because they don't want to get stuck with all the liability. But if they're going to get all the dollars that they get and the profits that they get and all our personal information, they have to have more responsibility for the security piece of it. But I don't think it's easy to regulate. It just isn't. Do I want terrible, violent language on social media? No. But my very belief, just like yours, in the First Amendment and free speech is that, I'm not saying it. I can control what I say. I can't control what other people say. So the things around it and how it's packaged and maybe even how Facebook attracts some of the negative is where we need to look at versus some of the regulations.
Well, yeah, I agree. One of my big viewpoints on this is that I may find some of the bias on certain social media outlets like Twitter to be frustrating. I may find it to be inappropriate. But I do believe that a private company should be able to manage its platform that way, and I worry much more about Uncle Sam getting involved in making determinations as to what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, because then that enters into the realm of government and, yes, actually brings in explicit constitutional questions and all those kinds of things. And I worry about the notion of government-regulated speech in the United States, like we're increasingly seeing over, for example, across the pond in the UK, where it's not just the European Union, which the UK is obviously hopefully hoping in their mind to figure out the whole Brexit situation and get away from the EU, but UK, Theresa May, the Prime Minister there, really doing what she can to crack down on some of these things and I think suppress a lot of the free speech, and that's something that is a big concern growing here in the United States if you get government involved in something that should be, in my view, regulated or determined by these companies.
Yeah, the companies really is where the companies just don't want the liability. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So they are just saying, okay, we got to, you people or we or, the government is saying this. So they're pushing off the liabilities factor here. And this is where then the government needs to turn around to the Facebooks and the Apples and the Netflixes even of the world and say, this is how you have to protect information, or this is what's required of you when you have vendors and subcontractors that are within your control and getting paid by you. So that's where the legislators then, our Congress, needs to enforce against those corporate entities how it's gathering how they are gathering the information. So again, we go back to it's a very dynamic world. Nothing happens in a silo anymore like it might have 50 or 60 years ago.
And this goes back to a topic that I was discussing about an hour ago, and that is the notion of economic self-interest, the idea of businesses sort of making their own determinations on these kinds of things versus political self-interest, which is politicians maybe making laws or regulations put into effect because they view some sort of a benefit from taking those types of actions. And I trust the economic self-interest component more than the political self-interest, because of political self-interest, you have authority to lock people up in jail and those kinds of things. You don't have that authority when you're talking about it in the private sector. But I digress, because I want to ask you this question, which is, I think, very important as we start to wrap up here, tied in with the whole fake news issue. You were a TV news reporter. You've done a lot of radio. You're a podcast host. How do you think people should ferret out information in this sort of genuine fake news era on social media to be able to determine what's legit and what's not?
Well, I think people, first of all, have to ask themselves, how gullible am I, right? Like, first you have to find out your own kind of BS meter. And are you just believing everything you see and read? And mainly, you need to check sources. Where did this come from? Look at those URLs. Make sure they're .coms and .nets and not just have other letters after them so that they look like the fake URLs. double check. I mean, if you see a reporter on something and they've said something that just doesn't seem to click, drop them a line. Most reporters are on various social media. They have emails, they have phone numbers. So it's up to us to also be more discerning.
And a final question, Roshini Rajkumar, before we let you go, your final thoughts on the whole tragedy and of the terrorist attacks that took place yesterday in Sri Lanka.
Well, it's too bad that it's a tragedy that gets us talking about this beautiful country on the other side of the world from the United States. Hopefully people will get to know Sri Lanka better now, unfortunately through the tragic lens, but they'll learn that, since the Civil War ended about a decade ago, the tourist industry is back in a great place. It's just a beautiful place. It's a beautiful place. So I do hope people keep an open mind, maybe think of visiting it one day once it gets past this tragedy. And it also shows how interconnected the world is, because there are so many religions now, even in a country that's not that large on a map, that has many, many millions of people and different races and religions living in one place. So hopefully it will get more people talking, more dialogue going in different workplaces, and usually there's some kind of light and silver lining that comes out of these tragedies.
Well, and hopefully it will also give a lesson about the hatred that we're seeing now, the religious hatred that we're seeing, in terms of bringing that down. I mean, it really is not something that has any place in civilized society.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Jimmy. Well said.
Roshini Rajkumar, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much, and best wishes to you, your family, and everyone who's either from or in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Jimmy. You have a great week.
You as well. Again, Roshini Rajkumar, check out her website, ownyourwow.com. Again, her book, Communicate That. Always great to check in with Roshini, even on a heart-wrenching topic like this. We're going to take a break.